The medical community is starting to raise serious alarms about the bread millions of people in the UK eat every single day. According to warnings shared by NHS doctors, the number of health issues being linked to ingredients used in many mass-produced breads is becoming difficult to ignore. Doctors say the pattern is showing up more often in hospitals and clinics, raising questions about what people are actually consuming in these everyday loaves. That loaf you picked up for breakfast might contain ultra-processed ingredients, hidden sugars, and additives that health experts say can affect blood sugar levels, digestion, and long-term well-being. In this video, we're exposing 8 UK bread brands NHS doctors say you should be careful with. We'll look at what's really inside these loaves, why certain ingredients are raising concerns among health experts, and which breads may be the most troubling of all. By the end of this video, you may never look at supermarket bread the same way again. Bread 8. Tesco Value. Tesco Value Bread is one of the cheapest loaves you'll find on supermarket shelves, and that low price is exactly why it deserves a closer look. Many shoppers grab it without thinking twice. It's convenient, affordable, and widely available. For families trying to keep their grocery bills down, it feels like a practical choice. Bread is bread, right? At least that's what most people assume when they toss it into their basket. But when you turn the bag over and read the ingredients list, you begin to notice how modern industrial bread can be very different from the simple loaves people use to make at home. Traditional bread is usually made with just a few ingredients: flour, water, yeast, and a little salt. That's it. The dough is mixed, allowed to rise naturally, and baked once it develops the right structure. In many traditional bakeries, this process takes several hours, sometimes longer, depending on the type of bread being made. That slower process allows the dough to ferment naturally and develop flavor and texture without needing a long list of additives. Mass-produced bread like Tesco's value range works very differently. To produce huge quantities quickly and keep the price extremely low, manufacturers often rely on refined flour, vegetable oils, and modified starches designed to maintain softness and extend shelf life. These ingredients help the bread stay fluffy and uniform for longer periods of time. Nutrition experts often point out that these types of ingredients are commonly found in what researchers now classify as ultra-processed foods. In recent years, studies have increasingly linked diets high in ultra-processed foods to health concerns such as weight gain, metabolic problems, and digestive discomfort. Now, eating a sandwich once in a while isn't necessarily the issue. The real concern comes from frequency. Bread is something many people eat every single day. Toast in the morning, sandwiches at lunch, sometimes even as part of dinner. And when a food becomes part of your daily routine, the quality of its ingredients begins to matter a lot more. But if you think this loaf raises questions, wait until you see the next bread brand on this list, because the way it's produced may surprise you even more. Bread 7. Warburton's. The main issue many health experts point out with this bread is how fast it's made. Warburton's is one of the most recognizable bread brands in the UK. It's trusted, widely available, and for many families, it's the loaf that ends up on the table every single week. Because the brand has been around for decades, people naturally assume they're buying something traditional, something close to the kind of bread their parents or grandparents used to eat. But much of the bread produced at this scale is made using a method called the Chorleywood bread process. This process was developed in Britain in the 1960s to massively speed up bread production. Instead of allowing dough to rise slowly through natural fermentation, powerful industrial mixers work the dough at extremely high speeds, while additional yeast and dough improvers are added to accelerate the process. In many large bakeries, bread can move from raw ingredients to packaged loaf in just a few hours. Now, from a manufacturing perspective, this system is incredibly efficient. It allows factories to produce huge numbers of loaves quickly and keep supermarket shelves constantly stocked. But speeding up fermentation also changes how the bread behaves once it's eaten. During traditional bread making, slower fermentation helps break down certain wheat compounds and allows the dough to develop naturally. When that process is rushed, those compounds may remain more intact. Some nutrition specialists say this is one reason certain people report feeling bloated, heavy, or uncomfortable after eating highly processed white bread. The faster production process also means manufacturers often rely on emulsifiers, flour treatment agents, and dough conditioners to help the bread achieve the soft texture people expect. These additives help keep the loaf fluffy and uniform, but they also move the product further away from the simple ingredient bread people used to eat. And when something like bread becomes part of your everyday routine, breakfast toast, lunch sandwiches, evening snacks, even small differences in how it's made can start to matter. But if you think speed is the only shortcut used in modern bread, the next brand on this list raises a completely different question. Because what looks like fresh bakery bread may not actually be as fresh as it seems. Bread 6. Lidl Baker's Life. The main issue surrounding this bread isn't just the ingredients. It's the idea of freshness. Walk into many Lidl stores and you'll immediately notice the smell of warm bread. The bakery section looks inviting. Trays of golden loaves, crusty rolls, and fresh-looking bread being placed on the shelves throughout the day. For many shoppers, that smell and presentation create a strong impression that the bread is being made fresh right there in the store. But what many people don't realize is that much of this bread isn't actually made from scratch inside the supermarket. Instead, a large portion of these bakery products are produced using something known as part baking. The bread is prepared and partially baked in large industrial bakeries, often in other countries across Europe. After that, the loaves are frozen and transported to stores. Once they arrive, they're placed in ovens and baked again so they finish cooking right in the shop. That final baking stage is what creates the smell of fresh bread. From a retail perspective, this system works very well. It allows supermarkets to offer bakery-style products without needing full bakeries or trained bakers in every store. But from a food perspective, the process can introduce additional steps that traditional bread never needed. Bread that is frozen and transported often requires stabilizers, improvers, or additional ingredients to help it maintain its structure after thawing and baking again. Freezing can also affect the internal texture of the dough, meaning extra gluten or conditioners may be added during production to keep the bread soft. For some people, these extra processing steps may contribute to digestive discomfort or sensitivity, especially when combined with refined flour and other additives already present in many supermarket breads. Again, the concern isn't that eating one roll occasionally will cause harm. The issue is how often these products appear in everyday diets. When something is eaten daily, small processing differences can begin to add up over time. And if the idea of fresh bread being finished in store rather than made there surprises you, the next brand on this list raises another question entirely. The next loaf we're looking at has built its reputation on being healthy and wholesome, but the ingredient list tells a slightly different story. Bread 5. Hovis. Hovis has spent decades building its reputation as one of Britain's most traditional and wholesome bread brands. The packaging often highlights heritage, wholemeal grains, and that classic countryside feel. When people see a Hovis loaf on the shelf, the natural assumption is that it must be one of the healthier choices available. But once you flip the bag over and start reading the ingredient list, things can become a little more complicated. Many popular loaves from this brand still contain ingredients commonly used in industrial bread production, things like vegetable oils, emulsifiers, and colouring agents. These ingredients help give the bread a softer texture, a more appealing colour, and a longer shelf life on supermarket shelves. For example, certain breads use colouring to make the loaf appear darker or more whole grain than it actually is. While these additives are approved for food use, nutrition experts often point out that they serve mostly cosmetic purposes rather than adding any real nutritional value. Another point that health professionals sometimes highlight is how some brown or wholemeal style breads are made. In certain cases, the flour used is processed in stages, where parts of the wheat are separated and later recombined. While the final product may still meet food standards, critics argue that this method isn't quite the same as using fully intact whole grain flour from the start. The bigger concern comes from how these breads are often perceived. When a loaf is marketed as wholesome or healthy, many people assume they can eat it freely without paying much attention to portion sizes or ingredients. But when that bread still contains refined flour, added oils, and multiple processing steps, the nutritional picture can look very different from what the packaging suggests. That's why many nutrition experts recommend paying close attention not just to the front of the package, but to the full ingredient list on the back. Now, before we continue, if you're finding this breakdown useful, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people learn what's really inside the everyday foods they buy without thinking twice. And if you thought the healthy branding around this loaf was misleading, the next bread on our list raises a completely different concern, one that comes down to how unbelievably cheap some supermarket bread has become. Bread 4. Asda Smart Price. Imagine walking into a supermarket and seeing a full loaf of bread that costs less than many bottled drinks. For many shoppers, that price feels like a bargain. Bread is something families eat almost every day, so finding a loaf that costs far less than others on the shelf can feel like a smart way to save money. This is exactly the role Asda Smart Price Bread plays in many supermarkets. It's designed to be one of the lowest cost loaves available, giving shoppers a basic option that fits tight budgets. And for households trying to stretch their weekly grocery spending, it can be an easy choice to reach for. But when food becomes extremely cheap, an important question starts to appear. What had to change in order to make it that cheap? Producing bread at a very low price usually means the entire manufacturing process has been pushed toward maximum efficiency. The flour used is typically highly refined white flour, which is cheaper to produce and easier to process in large industrial bakeries. The dough is mixed quickly, shaped rapidly by machines, and baked in massive quantities so thousands of loaves can be produced every hour. That level of industrial scale helps drive the price down. However, refining flour removes several parts of the grain that naturally contain fiber, vitamins, and minerals. While some nutrients are added back later through fortification, many nutrition experts point out that refined flour still behaves very differently inside the body compared to less processed whole grain flour. One of the biggest concerns doctors often highlight is how quickly refined white bread is digested. Because much of the fiber has been removed, the carbohydrates break down rapidly in the body. This can cause blood sugar levels to spike quickly after eating. When this happens occasionally, the body can usually regulate it without much trouble. But when highly refined bread becomes a regular part of daily meals, toast in the morning, sandwiches at lunch, and another slice later in the day, those repeated blood sugar spikes can become more significant over time. Health experts often link diets high in refined carbohydrates with increased risks of weight gain, insulin resistance, and energy crashes throughout the day. Another factor behind extremely cheap bread is shelf stability. To ensure the loaf remains soft and sellable for longer periods, manufacturers sometimes rely on dough conditioners and preservatives that help maintain texture during storage and transport. Again, none of this necessarily makes the bread dangerous on its own. The bigger issue doctors emphasize is frequency and dependency. When the cheapest and most processed options become everyday staples in the diet, the long-term nutritional balance of meals can slowly shift in an unhealthy direction. And if the economics behind ultra-cheap bread already raise concerns, the next brand on this list highlights a different issue entirely. The next loaf shows how some supermarket breads rely heavily on preservatives and shelf-life additives to stay soft far longer than traditional bread ever could. Bread 3. Sainsbury's own brand. Traditional bread made in a small bakery often begins to go stale within a day or two. If you've ever bought fresh bread from a local bakery, you'll notice that by the second or third day, it starts to harden or dry out. That's because traditional bread contains very few ingredients, usually just flour, water, yeast, and salt. Without added stabilizers or preservatives, bread naturally has a short life. But many supermarket loaves today can sit on shelves for several days while still remaining soft and sliceable. Even after being stored at home, some loaves stay fluffy far longer than traditional bread ever did. This is where the conversation around preservatives and shelf-life additives begins. Like many supermarket own brand products, certain Sainsbury's bread lines are produced on a large industrial scale. To help these loaves stay soft, maintain texture, and resist mold during storage and transport, manufacturers may use dough conditioners, emulsifiers, and preservatives designed to slow down the natural aging process of bread. One commonly discussed example is calcium propionate, a preservative widely used in packaged bread to help prevent mold growth. From a food safety perspective, this ingredient allows bread to remain sellable for longer periods without spoiling quickly. However, some nutrition researchers and health commentators have raised questions about how frequently people consume foods that rely on these kinds of additives. Bread is rarely eaten occasionally. For many households, it's a daily staple. Toast for breakfast, sandwiches for lunch, and sometimes snacks throughout the day. Because of that, any ingredient used to extend shelf life ends up being consumed regularly. Some people report experiencing digestive discomfort or sensitivity when eating breads containing certain preservatives or dough conditioners, although reactions can vary widely from person to person. Another concern doctors sometimes mention is that extended shelf life products may encourage people to rely heavily on processed packaged foods rather than fresher alternatives. When food stays soft and stable for long periods, it becomes easier for highly processed versions of that food to dominate everyday diets. None of this means that eating a slice occasionally will automatically cause harm. The larger issue health experts highlight is long-term dietary patterns. What happens when foods with added preservatives become routine parts of daily meals? And if extended shelf life already raises questions about how modern bread is made, the next brand on this list reveals another concern entirely. Because the next loaf is one many people believe is one of the healthiest options available. Yet the nutritional reality may be more complicated than the packaging suggests. Bread 2. Kingsmill. Kingsmill bread is one of the most widely distributed brands in the UK. Its loaves appear in supermarkets across the country every day, and the consistency is almost identical from one store to another. The slices look the same, the softness is the same, and the texture rarely changes. But maintaining that level of consistency on such a massive scale requires a very different approach to bread making. Large factories rely on highly controlled formulas designed to behave the same way every time the dough is mixed. That often means combining refined flour, dough conditioners, emulsifiers, stabilizers, and carefully measured additives, so the bread rises quickly and maintains the same soft texture across thousands of batches. In industrial baking plants, machines can mix and process enormous volumes of dough at once, producing bread far faster than traditional methods ever could. From a manufacturing perspective, this system is incredibly efficient. It ensures every loaf looks uniform and every slice fits neatly into the packaging people expect. But some nutrition specialists point out that bread produced at this scale tends to rely heavily on refined white flour, which removes much of the grain's natural fiber during processing. Without that fiber, the carbohydrates in the bread can be broken down more rapidly during digestion. That's why doctors often talk about how quickly certain white breads can raise blood sugar levels after eating. When refined bread becomes a regular part of daily meals, breakfast toast, lunch sandwiches, and snacks, those rapid spikes in blood glucose can happen repeatedly throughout the day. Over time, diets built heavily around refined carbohydrates have been associated with energy crashes, increased hunger shortly after eating, and potential long-term metabolic strain. Again, the concern isn't a single slice of bread. The concern is how frequently these kinds of loaves appear in everyday diets, especially when people eat bread several times a day. And if the scale of industrial bread production already sounds surprising, the number one bread on this list highlights something even more concerning, because the final loaf shows just how far modern factory bread has moved away from the simple 4-ingredient bread many people think they're buying. Bread 1, Aldi Village Bakery. There's a simple thing you can do at home that many people never think about. Take a slice of Aldi bread and leave it out on the kitchen counter for several days. Not inside the sealed bag, just leave it exposed to the air and observe what happens. At first, nothing seems unusual. The slice still looks soft, still looks edible, but after a while, subtle changes begin to appear. The color of the bread may start to shift. Small dark patches or unusual discolorations can develop. The texture can change in ways that don't look like normal bread aging. And one of the first things people often notice is the smell. Instead of simply smelling stale, the bread can sometimes give off a slightly sharp or chemical-like odor as it begins to deteriorate. This is where many food experts say the chemistry of modern bread becomes more visible. Mass-produced breads often contain preservatives, stabilizers, emulsifiers, and processing agents designed to control how the bread behaves over time. These ingredients help prevent rapid mold growth, maintain softness, and allow the bread to survive packaging, transportation, and long supermarket shelf lives. But when the bread eventually begins to break down, those chemical stabilizers can change the way the loaf ages. The discoloration, unusual smells, and texture shifts that appear over time are the result of chemical reactions happening inside the bread as those additives interact with moisture, air, and microorganisms. And this is where the bigger concern begins. Doctors working within the NHS have increasingly spoken about the broader health impact of diets heavily built around ultra-processed foods. These foods often contain multiple stabilizers, refined carbohydrates, and additives that were never part of traditional cooking. Bread may seem harmless because it's familiar and eaten every day. But when that bread contains refined flour combined with multiple chemical processing aids, the long-term effect on the body can be different from what people expect. Many hospitals are now seeing rising numbers of patients dealing with blood sugar instability, digestive disorders, metabolic strain, and diet-related health conditions linked to patterns of highly processed food consumption. Again, the issue isn't a single slice of bread. The issue is long-term exposure. When foods containing multiple processing chemicals are eaten eaten day after day, year after year, the body has to constantly process and respond to those substances. And that's why more health professionals are beginning to ask people to take a closer look at the foods they eat most often, especially something as common as bread. Because once you start noticing the chemical changes happening right in your own kitchen, it becomes harder to ignore the question many doctors are now raising: what exactly are we really eating every day? Now, we'd like to hear from you. Have you ever checked the ingredient list on the bread you buy? Did any of the brands on this list surprise you? Let us know in the comments below, because your experience might help other viewers pay closer attention to what they're bringing home from the supermarket. And if you found this video helpful, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people discover what's really happening behind everyday foods we often trust without question. Because sometimes the biggest food stories aren't about rare products or unusual ingredients. They're about the foods we eat every single day without thinking twice.